Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Episode number 364 of We Are Podcast. It is all about the rhythm of connection. We talk about podcast strategies for deep engagement, and I have a series of gentlemen here that will help us all think about these strategies of engagement and deep engagement very differently. I have the phenomenal Joey Coleman, who taught me the true value of my podcast lies in my ability to refine my thoughts and my ideas. Jason Irving reminded me that the core of my message and my podcasting journey is to go deeper into personal growth strategies. Cameron Harold showed me the importance of being strategic with whom I invite onto my podcast. Ethan Castiosis impressed me upon the power of asking insightful and high quality questions to make my podcast stand out. And Byron Dempsey reinforced the impactful idea that the podcast really can be for young listeners and how he does it. So come, let's learn.
You can't find your voice if you don't use it. This is We Are Podcast, formerly called Should I Start a Podcast? A podcast for podcasters who want a podcast that grows their business and brand. How many times can we say podcast in a sentence? Here's your host, Ronsley. He has interviewed more than 1,500 people, has been listened to over 5 million times in 133 countries. He has helped create over 1,100 podcasts for businesses, brands, and personalities. He's been doing this for more than a decade. Get ready to take notes. Enjoy the show.
So the way I kind of tell business owners who are starting a podcast that if you were to get successful by doing a rep, what would that look like? And this is the example is like doing the interview, having the connection, making this deep connection with someone, and then seeing how the possibilities turn out, right? How do you go about making business development conversations, or how do you create that with the podcast? Once it's done, how do you get that to other people? Because what you've cut out of your whole equation is the fact that your guest is not sharing it to their audience, right? So how do you compensate for that with the concept of your show? Or do you at all? Or do you even care?
Yeah, I won't be so brazen as to say that I don't care, but it's not a priority. Business development for me from the podcast is not a priority. And in the answer to full disclosure, and I think he'd be fine with me sharing this, my co-host Dan and I, our priorities and our intentions have evolved and changed over the course of the 10 seasons. We're in season 10 right now, right? So there have been times where it's been more important to do something than other. When we first started, we basically had a situation where our mutual friend Jay Bear, I'll tell this story real quickly. I'm giving a speech at an event called Social Media Marketing World, which is hysterical because I am not on social media in any way, shape, or form. And I'm the closing keynote at Social Media Marketing World. So it's super exciting. At the time I took the stage, I had 124 followers on Twitter. Not 124 million, not 124,000, 124, because I had signed up for Twitter the week before. And then it got tweeted right before my keynote that what my handle was, and a bunch of people in the room started following me. So I went from like 124 followers at the beginning of the keynote to like several hundred at the end of the keynote because,
wow.
And I don't know if I have tweeted, I don't remember doing it, right? So we have very different approaches, whereas my co-host Dan is all about the Twitters. And that's a running joke on our show, right? He's all about the tweets and the Twitters and all of that stuff. So I think at the end of the day, couple things as it relates to business development. My main intention for the podcast is to clarify my thinking.
Yeah.
That's why I do the show.
Yeah.
I do the show to solidify and clarify my thinking, because as a speaker and a writer and a consultant, that is hugely valuable to me. I can monetize that clarity of thought in those other verticals a lot faster and with a lot headache and heartache than trying to monetize it in the podcast.
When did you first find out about podcasting, and how long ago was that? And like, where are you at with your podcasting journey right now?
Okay, so I actually heard about you, Ronsley, in a group called Black Belt, and you were the podcast dude. And someone just told me I should podcast with these things that we should be doing right now. And so I decided to just set one up with no idea of what it was going to look like. So someone set me up with a podcasting website and I just started. So I didn't really have any forethought about how to do something. And my biggest gift is helping uncover what's going on the inside with people. So I put my name as Uncovered as the podcast and started sharing a whole bunch of stuff personally around what I was uncovering with myself and people, and then started getting people like yourself on my podcast as well.
So for context, right, you're a coach and you have a podcast. So it's actually called the Uncovered Podcast, and the idea is that you uncover what people have on the inside. What kind of
Yeah.
conversations are you having, and who are you inviting onto the show, and what kind of content are you creating?
Okay, so the content that I'm wanting to create is finding out what is really going on with people. So a lot of people are sharing their content and what they do. I'm wanting to dig underneath about the reasons why they do it and what's really going on the inside. So I've had people who naturally share their content in their delivery, and I'm actually trying to find out, well, why are they building that content in the first place? What's the meaning behind it? And who is the person that's actually behind the content? And I found it being really, really interesting. I have a lot of people just say, oh, wow, that was a really good, I wasn't expecting to talk about certain things that I spoke about during our conversation, because usually people are talking about what they do in their business and what's really important in their business. Whereas I'm actually trying to find out about, well, who's behind the business and the reason that people have started their businesses in the first place. So I spend a lot of time with, business coaches, people who are in the health profession. My background is in the health profession, so lots of people who do health, and I also uncover some of the academy members that have broken through their paradigms. So quite often it's looking at the things that we all find that are a little bit stuck in our lives and uncovering those things so we can find out what's really going on. In a group called Black Belt, and you were the podcast dude, and someone just told me I should podcast with these things that we should be doing right now. And so I decided to just set one up with no idea of what it was going to look like. So someone set me up with a podcasting website and I just started. So I didn't really have any forethought about how to do something. And my biggest gift is helping uncover what's going on the inside with people. So I put my name as Uncovered as the podcast and started sharing a whole bunch of stuff personally around what I was uncovering with myself and people, and then started getting people like yourself on my podcast as well.
So
At the moment, I've
yeah. So for context, right, you're a coach and you have a podcast that helps. Oh, well, so it's actually called the Uncovered Podcast, and the idea is that you uncover what people have on the inside. What kind of
Yeah.
conversations are you having, and like who are you inviting onto the show, and what kind of content are you creating? And let's start with what kind of content are you creating, and then we'll get into the business side of things.
Okay, so the content that I'm wanting to create is finding out what is really going on with people. So a lot of people are sharing their content and what they do. I'm wanting to dig underneath about the reasons why they do it and what's really going on the inside. So I've had people who naturally share their content in their delivery, and I'm actually trying to find out, well, why are they building that content in the first place? What's the meaning behind it? And who is the person that's actually behind the content? And I found it being really, really interesting. I have a lot of people just say, oh, wow, that was a really good, I wasn't expecting to talk about certain things that I spoke about during our conversation, because usually people are talking about what they do in their business and what's really important in their business. Whereas I'm actually trying to find out about, well, who's behind the business and the reason that people have started their businesses in the first place. So I spend a lot of time with, business coaches, people who are in the health profession. My background is in the health profession, so lots of people who do health, and I also uncover some of the academy members that have broken through their paradigms. So quite often it's looking at the things that we all find that are a little bit stuck in our lives and uncovering those things so we can find out what's really going on in life.
Hey, it's Mick Hawes, host of The Toolshed. I love making my podcast, and that's primarily because Ronsley has helped me avoid a whole bunch of really basic mistakes that would have cost me a whole bunch of time, money, and energy. And Rons has compiled a list of these mistakes and how to avoid them, which is really a steal. You can get your copy where I downloaded mine at mistakes.wearepodcast.com. That is mistakes.wearepodcast.com. We Are Podcast. You can't find your voice if you don't use it.
Let's talk about your podcast, The Second in Command. What made you start that? And what was the hardest thing to get going when you had that going?
So once I understood the idea, the hardest part was figuring out who the heck am I going to interview? And I realized that I wasn't going to have a bunch of people beating their path to my door to be on the actual podcast. I had to go out and actually figure out who they were going to be. So it started with me pulling together a list of companies that I knew the CEO, where I could reach out to the CEO and say, hey, would you like to be a guest on the podcast? Now, the COO Alliance at the time was about a year old. So we also reached out to some of our early COO Alliance members, some of the best ones there, and we started to interview those as well. And we got lucky. Like I think our first or second guest was the COO of Shopify, Harley Finkelstein, professional baseball teams and Asana and Active Campaign. Like we've had some really, really good companies. We've had their second commands on as guests. But in the early days, it was calling in every favor I could to get the first 10. Then I went out and found a guy who was kind of like a full commission salesperson. And I paid him $500 for every podcast guest he could find me who was running a company between 50 and 500 million in revenue. He came back with 5 or 6 and I said, okay, we're good. We're done. We reached out to some PR firms in the Bay Area. And I said, hey, I want to get some technology companies on my podcast. I know that you fund a lot of technology, or you do PR for a lot of technology companies. Why don't you get some of your companies that you're funding who are cool brands in this space to be on? And they all did it. So all of a sudden, and they're getting paid to find press coverage, and I become one of their press coverages, and it's good for me and it's good for them. So that's been a really good way to do it as well. And now we're starting to reach out to some private equity firms and some VC firms to see if we can kind of get those to start giving us lead gen as well.
Yeah. I mean, you've got so many things going on. And obviously you mentioned about how if it's not a fuck yeah, let's not do it. What made the podcast a fuck yeah?
It wasn't really a fuck yeah at the beginning. It was an intuitive gut check where I just thought, it feels like this will be good exposure. Podcasting was going, but it wasn't the hype that it is today, but it was going. I wrote a book called Free PR. So I knew that if I got 10 or 20 guests on my podcast, I could share those episodes on Facebook and LinkedIn and email it out to my list and share it with members. And I could amplify. And even if no one ever found the episodes, I could share them with enough people that it would make some credibility. So I kind of knew that I would get enough value. And then I just thought, let's just see what the response is like. And if people like it, we'll keep doing it. Sure enough, people actually really liked it. Now it looks like almost every single person who joins the COO Alliance has already been listening to a few of the Second in Command podcast episodes. It's kind of started to build a little bit of that third-party proof.
So if I had to say to you, well, what is the returns that you get from doing this? How does the business benefit, and how does it give you back the energy you put in, the money? What does that look like?
Okay, so I won't go to the obvious because I don't want to forget the less obvious ones. And I wish I'd done this from the very beginning. I'm now doing all of my podcast episodes on video. So I use dual track audio via Zoom, and then I can actually take all of these video episodes we've got, send them off to my social media team. They can slice down any of the good responses. We can use those on social. We're now taking the actual podcast interview on video and putting it onto a YouTube channel for the podcast. We're amplifying the message there as well. We're using it as marketing. we're sending out the actual episode to our clients and asking them to share it on their social media channels, on their email lists, and we're tracking it and we're giving them 3 hits, pushing them 3 times over the course of 6 weeks to make sure that they're sharing it. Otherwise, some people don't, some do, but we push them to share it and that gets more amplification. Some of the guests of the Second Command podcast have later joined the COO Alliance, even though they didn't know about it in advance. Many of them are buying seats in my Invest in Your Leaders course because somehow it gets woven into the conversation or they see it on my email PSs when we go back and forth. So it's been really good for building brand. It's been really good for building third-party proof and really good for extra social media content that we can use as well.
The podcast, how did it come about? What was the process like? How did you think about it? What happened and how did it start? Give us that backstory.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have probably thought about doing a podcast. I know I had, before I did it for many years, and basically, listening to Joe Rogan or whoever you listen to, right? And then it's just sort of been in the back of my mind, maybe I should do it. And then I was just on one of my coaching calls, a virtual one with one of my coaches in the US. And, I was being very strategic and I was asking very high quality questions, because if you start asking high quality questions, you start to get noticed, right? Because it's not just a standard question. So that was a little strategy, a little pro tip of mine to be noticed in a big room of people online. And then he messaged me and he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And he said, you need to have a podcast, you need a show. I'm like, okay, cool. If someone's worth that much money, tells me to do that, then it just solidified this thought that I've been having for a few years before that I need to do this. Okay, cool. So I've been thinking about these few names to him, I said, and he goes, yep, I love the Business Growth Show. Let's do that one. You can interview me as one of your first interviews. He said to me as well, let's get this show on the road, basically. And I said, all right, done. So then at that point, I'm like, I'm committing to this, right? Like if ever I do something, like I've already mentioned, I have to commit. The first episode was just a little bit on mindset. I wanted to touch on mindset by myself. That's the only episode I've done by myself. I potentially might do more in the future, but then every other episode from there is interviewing people. And basically I thought to myself, well, it's the Business Growth Show. I wanted to keep it wide on purpose as well, because to me, yes, there's power in niches, if you want to go a bit more specific on that, but I like width because it gives me more flexibility in the show, because it allows me to talk about all areas of business, and mindset is also a part about business, and even, how the business affects your life and everything like that. So there's a lot of different ways. So I had that analogy from the start to give myself flexibility. And then I basically just reached out to my network. I'm quite connected, right? And even more so now with all the podcast episodes. And I thought, who are some great people that, are successful in their own right in different areas, and just started reaching out to them saying, hey, I'd love to, for you to be on my podcast, and get those first few down the line, and then, building it from there. And it was very basic to begin with. Like, just, you don't have to start with all the whiz bang stuff as well. Like I literally had like a standard camera, the same camera I do now. I didn't even have a proper microphone when I first started. And then, just kept going from there. And it's amazing, how much you learn from these people by asking great questions. And I think it's all about the power of the question, because there's so many times that I've done interviews where people have said, I've been interviewed so many times and no one's ever asked me that question. So I always challenge myself to go, how can I ask something different when I've interviewed massive people, and obviously some normal people as well that are entrepreneurs, and you never know who you're going to meet and then what's going to transpire from that. I think that's, part of what I love about it is the relationships. Yes, we want to hope that, it obviously builds our authority, our credibility and everything like that, but the relationships and the knowledge that you get from the podcast, I think is invaluable.
I know your goal is having this impact on young people's lives. How does Driven Young, and how do you measure that success from the podcast, or do you at all? Is there any correlation between the two?
Yeah, I don't watch numbers really, just because I find that there are benefits, but the negatives outweigh it, in my opinion, just because I get caught up in it. Same with like followers and whatnot. I still think it's important, definitely, to be like tracking that stuff. I think for me, the way I measure it, maybe in a unique way, is based on the messages I get. So I always encourage my followers. I'm always like, guys, please send me a DM. There's like a few thousand people who listen to this episode. I'm sure one of you can send me a DM. I always say stuff like that. And yeah, I've got like a folder of like 500 plus messages. And it's not just, hey, Byron, enjoy the podcast. It's like, hey, Byron, your podcast changed my life. Hey, Byron, I landed an internship at a top law firm based off a networking strategy we discussed on one of your episodes. And I've been telling all my friends about the show. Hey, Byron, I'm 14 years old from Canada, and I listen to this podcast in the car with my mum. And for me, that's how I measure success, because those are the ones that just make me feel so amazing. And it shows that I'm actually having an impact. We always compare ourselves to people ahead of us, right? I'm nowhere near as big as a lot of podcasters in the world, but I'm bigger than most, because most podcasters don't have any listeners really. I definitely don't want to get caught into like, oh, looking at the big numbers and just go, look, I mean, I'm making an impact. And the truth is, a podcast, whether you have any listeners, there's unbelievable benefits. The networking, the skill set of asking questions, the skill set of communicating effectively. So yeah, there's definitely so many benefits if you have no listeners. I think it's good if you could expand to you have someone on your team doing that. So that way you're not caught in it and you can just have a team member tracking all the numbers and that stuff, because it's still important. But for me, it was just like, I just want to keep doing good work. And the podcast it's now led to my whole company, which is called Driven Young. And I have an entire revenue model. I have a whole program and all these team now. And that started as a base route. It started from a podcast, which just expanded into something big.
That's so cool. I love hearing your story, especially because I knew you before the podcast, and now I know what the podcast has created for you. And even listening now, I'm like, wow, it's really cool that We Are Podcast played some sort of role in that story, because
dude, it played a big one. It was like the push. You know, I'm like 90% there, but the last 10%, not many people can get to. We Are Podcast was, I can do this.
Yeah, wow. Sometimes I don't even realize, what I made back then, and going through what I thought it was a hassle, because it was really interesting with We Are Podcast, the conference especially. It was that I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed the speaker retreat that happened afterwards. I want to talk about your second podcast. So you've gotten to how many episodes of Driven Young when you decided that you want to create a second podcast, and what made you do it, and how is it different?
There's actually 3 podcasts. So the second one was actually called Consent and Consequences. And after I did an episode with a guy called Brent Sanders, I think he was around episode 35. So he came to my school in year 10 and spoke about sexual assault education. And he's amazing. He's an ex-police officer. He's an incredible speaker. He's been doing it for 25 years and he's incredible. And that episode just went gangbusters. It got millions and millions of views on TikTok. And Brent kind of said, yeah, but I've been interested in doing my own podcast. And I was like, well, what if we did it together? Like, what if I interviewed you? So rather than you have to sit there and have to like talk it out, I'll just interview you. I can do all the back end. I'll do all the work, but you let me use your name and brand and your skill set. And that was pretty much the agreement. There was no exchange of money. It was just an exchange of time. So he came in for a day and we shot an 8-part series in one day. We just smashed it out. And I then spent a whole bunch of hours editing it and we put that up. And in 3 months, we hit 300,000 followers on TikTok off the back of these clips. The third one, which is the one I was mentioning, came from the TikTok strategy. So when me and my mate, who's my best friend now, we moved into a new place, I set up a podcast studio downstairs for Driven Young. And we figured, well, look, we've got the studio here. It's only being used like once a week. We may as well use it. And he said, what if we started a podcast just about stories and we did it specifically for TikTok? And then we started going, oh yeah, that'd be cool. But they need a reason to stay. And we had this idea called like true or false, where we can make up stories and it'll either be true or false. And they have to stay until the very end to find out if it's true or false. We then renamed it to fact or cap, because that's like fact or cap is like TikTok lingo that kids use. And we pretty much just started a podcast where literally all we would do is sit down in podcasts and we'd just share the most insane stories we could find from around the world, or we'd either make them up. And you had to guess if they were true or false. And then every single story became a TikTok clip. And then we hit 100,000 followers in like a month. It massively slowed down from there. And we haven't had much growth in the last kind of year because it's been so busy. But yeah, that just kind of took off. And now that's turned into a live show. So the podcast has kind of switched into more of like a live show. We do like live performances. We do the show live. We take the podcast format and make it live. We also do some like dating stuff. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And so that was, again, just using that podcast strategy, which now is quite common. But when I started, it wasn't that common.
Thank you so much for listening. Listen to the back catalog of over 300 episodes by going to wearepodcast.com. If you're looking for something specific, let the We Are Podcast team point you in the right direction. Send us an email on podcast@wearepodcast.com. Also, if you know a business owner who has a podcast, ask them to listen. Share an episode with them. The conversations here are going to save them lots of trial, error, time, and money. Until next week, much love.